Hall of glass and silk. Late afternoon. She steps into a room built to reflect light. Crystal chandeliers hang like constellations. Marble floors mirror the sway of dresses. Laughter ripples and refracts. Lila feels the heat of 100 glances as if they could burn through linen and leave judgment on skin. Her veil brushes the polished banister, a thin thing against the hulking opulence that has nothing to do with her. They call it her wedding, and in part it is. In part it is a display carefully arranged by people who measure worth by columns on balance sheets. Bridesmaids in gowns the color of champagne smile with blades in their eyes. The groom's family floats through the room in small knots. Vanessa at their center, immaculate, the kind of woman who thinks volume is a virtue and mercy a weakness. They line the perimeter like a reef guarding a ship, beautiful, impermeable, and indifferent to what happens inside. Lila holds a small cloth bag against her ribs. The bag is not the sort that belongs in a place like this. It smells faintly of lavender and boiled rice, and when she fingers its seam, her thumb finds the slow patch where Ruth, her mother, bound it months ago with thread that is frayed but not given. Inside is a book, no bigger than the palm of her hand, stitched by hand, pages soft with handling. Receipts, scribbled notes, a thin strip of calendar pages. Everything that proves the slow drain that had been happening while other people smiled and pretended nothing was wrong. Guests rustle as she passes. A cluster of giggling women tilt their heads toward her shoes. Charity chic, someone murmurs, the phrase wrapped as a compliment while spat as contempt. Lila hears it like a stone thrown into a well. At the altar, Daniel is a tall shape of careful clothes. He stands an even distance from everyone, a man styled into stillness. He smiles with a public smile that reaches the corners of his mouth, but not his eyes. The years of applause for boardroom speeches and ribbon cuttings have taught him how to be admired and how to avoid being seen. When the priest lifts his hands to begin, a hush like paper settles. Lila steps forward because she must. The music swells. She breathes and remembers the night a decade ago when he sat on the stoop of an old repair shop drinking cold coffee from a dented mug and said her name like it was a secret he intended to keep. 3 minutes before, seeded memory. There are moments that fold around the throat, little images you carry for a lifetime. For Lila, one of them is Ruth lighting one small bulb above the kitchen sink after the sun sets. The bulb shakes when Ruth moves in her chair. She sews at night by that single light. Sometimes Ruth hums to the rhythm of the needle. Sometimes she prays in a voice so low Lila can only hear the edges of the words. When money came occasionally, enough for beans, enough for a bus, the sound Ruth made was not triumph. It was the soft relief of someone who had finally been allowed to breathe. When Daniel first walked into Lila's neighborhood, he had the habit of looking at things the way he might examine a company to be bought, calculating potential. But he looked at Ruth like a person, not a balance sheet. He saw how she folded a blanket so the blanket fit a child's small back. He saw how she taught Lila to carve time into work, how kindness and sacrifice were work too. He promised, in the reckless way of those who haven't yet been dressed in gold, that he would see her always. Back then, his jacket had holes at the cuffs. When he kissed Lila in a doorway lit by a street lamp, there was nothing to be negotiated but hope. First block, the moment and the seed. The vows feel like a play everyone learned the lines for. Lila's voice is steady. She says what she must. Her mouth shapes the words courageously. What she cannot say aloud she has packed, page by page, into the small book in her bag. It is a ledger, tattered, stitched by Ruth on a night when the wind came through the cracks and the sewing needle trembled. The ledger contains numbers, dates, transfers, notes in Lila's cramped handwriting. July 12th. Transfer from Daniel's account to Family Trust, $5,000. Note, for Ruth's roof. Aug 30. Transfer from Daniel's account to Vanessa Enterprises, $5,000. Small things, every month for almost a year. Receipts for a roof that never got fixed. Bank transaction numbers and the names of businesses that do not exist on any street in their old neighborhood. A picture taped to one page, Ruth at a sink, smiling with a sauce stain on her apron. Daniel at her elbow, hat at a tilt. The ledger is the slow, patient story of kindness diverted into pockets. Lila thinks of the ledger like a heartbeat you measure when someone is asleep. She kept it because the world had taught her that data makes truth harder to deny. She kept it because she learned early that memory can be rewritten, but paper cannot. She had sworn to herself she would never make this room her battlefield. She had come to this marriage believing in marriage, in the private economies of love, shared bills, shared laughter, the soft give and take of a life woven together. But there is a difference between being poor and being invisible. Her poverty is not a costume. It is the shape of choices made long before she arrived here. People could strut about their inherited dining rooms, but they could not change the truth the ledger holds. If this story resonates, a quick like helps others find it. 2 years before. The rise. Daniel's name began as a whisper in newspapers, then become a headline. He had a rare gift for seeing where corridors of business met human need and building a bridge there. Offices blossomed under his direction. A startup became an empire. He left for months at a time on flights with names Lila had never heard, and returned with a careful kiss and a suitcase of apologies for absences he did not believe required explanation. He would call in the early morning, short notes of affection, and then disappear for days on end. When he returned, he brought gifts that smelled of another world, perfumes that hung in the air like vows, clothes stitched in languages Lila could not read. The gifts were not wrong. They simply meant that his currency had shifted from the small, daily attentions that guarded intimacy to larger gestures that did not mend what silence frayed. Lila watched him change like anyone watches a lover be consumed by a fire to which they cannot throw water. The fire made things shine that should not have, and burned ways of being that had once been hers. She understood success. She understood that with power comes distance. What she did not understand at first was how distance could be weaponized by someone else. Life with the in-laws. The first cuts. Vanessa is a study in small dismissals. She never says the words that make wounds. She prefers the subtler surgery of looks, of a hand placed on a glass, as if that gesture could keep Lila beyond an invisible line. You must know how to present yourself, Lila. Vanessa would advise in the kitchen that was 10 times the size of Lila's childhood sink. This is the way we do things. 'Tis a kindness to teach someone the rules of a new world, Lila thinks. It is a betrayal to insist they were born to break them. At dinner parties, Lila is told where to sit as if it is her place to be directed. A bridesmaid laughs too loud at a mispronounced word. The family jokes use her as punctuation. That laughter is brandished as social currency. Lila learns that shame can be parceled out in a smile. Each moment is small, an offhand critique about a dress seam, a suggestion on her manner of speaking, a borrowed phrase about rising into place. But together they accumulate into a pressure that reshapes how she moves her hands and where she lays her eyes. Financial edges are blunter. Bank accounts are consolidated for efficiency. We'll handle it, you won't have to worry, Vanessa tells her with a hand on Lila's elbow that both steadies and restrains. Checks that were meant for Ruth's roof pass through an intermediary. A transfer labeled Family Trust appears in Lila's ledger, the amount written in her careful hand with a note, intended for Ruth. Months later, there is a different name where the money went. The church gives Lila and her mother shelter in small mercies. Pastor Samuel, a man who never learned how to speak in languages of million-dollar deals, but who knows the mathematics of bread and water and human dignity, slips envelopes into Ruth's hands. Mr. Peter from the congregation brings blankets. They call it ministry. Ruth calls it kindness. No one there pretends to solve architecture of wealth, but they offer the soul-level architecture that makes surviving possible. Food, a place to sleep, someone who remembers your name. A quiet decline. Ruth's home shivers under the weight of neglect. Once there was paint that shone even if the floorboards bowed. Now the roof drips when summer storms come. The plumber cannot arrive because a check was supposed to clear and hasn't. Lila drives to Ruth's place and finds a sagging chair and a box of rusted cutlery. She has a feeling in her stomach that taste cannot wash away. "Do not worry," she tells her mother aloud, because in those moments the sound of her own voice is the only instrument she owns. Ruth smiles the way people who practice gratitude for small things smile, with the mouth and not the eyes. She has learned a surprising grace, one that keeps her upright even when her home cannot. Lila's ledger becomes a ritual. She writes receipts when payments come. She notes dates when she asks and the response she gets. Sometimes the entries are shorthand, a stick figure of intent. Sometimes they are angry. Sometimes they are just the quiet record-keeper's line. Oct 19 called Vanessa, voicemail. "We're managing." She knows ledger-keeping is the slow work of preservation. If anyone ever asked who did and who did not, pages could answer. There are nights when Lila thinks of walking away, not from Daniel. She thinks of walking away from the humiliation that feels casual, the kind that people perform with the ease of breathing. But from him she cannot picture leaving, because there are threads that bind them small and strong. She remembers him standing on the stoop once and saying, "I will not forget where I come from." She believes him, or she believed him, and belief is a kind of work. A friend, a promise. Maya, Lila's oldest friend from before the city taught them both the particularities of survival, is the kind of woman who will show up with a thermos and stay until the tea is gone. She sees ledger lines and sharpens them into a plan, not for revenge, but for justice. "You have to make it clear," she says, stirring her tea like a conductor warming an orchestra. "People believe what they can see. Make them see." It is Maya who suggests the wedding as a stage, not a spectacle. Lila recoils at that language, but a place where lies, when laid out, cannot be easily rearranged. "They will pretend not to notice at a backyard," Maya says. "They will pretend not to notice at breakfast. But a room full of people trained to look. Let them have something they can't unsee." Lila and Maya talk late into the nights, sketching possibility. Lila thinks a great deal about dignity. She has no desire to set a trap. She wants a truth to be spoken aloud. The ledger is not a weapon in her mind. It is evidence. Thin paper with numbers and names and a little photograph of Ruth that sings when the light hits it. Maya helps her tidy the small bag that will hold the book. They sew a patch on the seam with thread borrowed from Ruth's drawer. "Not a spectacle," Maya says again, seeing the fear tightening Lila's jaw. An unveiling. The dress and the silence. Vanessa offers a dress Lila cannot afford to refuse. An elegant arrangement of silk and lace that will stop conversation. "You must understand presentation matters," Vanessa says, as if Lila had come to these rooms as a blank slate waiting to be inscribed. Lila accepts because sometimes acceptance is a currency traded for peace. She thinks of dressing not as a mask but as a cloak, a covering that allows her to step into a dangerous room without being mistaken for something else. The dress fits. Silk slides over skin and hushes the sound of the body for a while. It does not buy dignity. It frames it. When Lila looks in a glass then, she sees both camouflage and a woman who has learned an expensive lesson. Belonging is not given for dresses, it is won by truth. The morning of the wedding. Small rituals. Ruth arrives at the small rental where Lila has been staying. She sits on a stool and brushes her daughter's hair with hands that have known the resistance of threads and the weight of pots. Ruth's fingers leave a print like a map. She touches Lila's cheek. "Remember who you are," she says softly, not instructing but anchoring. "Speak what you must." Lila smiles, and the smile is a fissure and a promise. "I will," she replies. She tucks the ledger into the cloth bag. The soft movement of concealment is familiar as prayer. The ledger rests against her heart like an accusation and like a rosary. Pastor Samuel comes by the little room before the ceremony. He prays a short, simple prayer with them. There is no sermon, only the hydraulic hiss of shared breathing and a sentence that fits the room. "May you be guided to do what is honest and merciful." His presence steadies. His words are not a map for justice, but a lamp for the ways of the heart. The hall and the dirt under fingernails. Lila thinks about the dirt that will always cling to Ruth's fingernails, the soil from the small plot of land where she used to grow kitchen herbs. She remembers a morning when Ruth gave her a piece of bread and a boiled egg, and how the taste of that simple meal was more complex than the gilded things she will see today. She thinks of how wealth can polish hands, and refused to notice the blistered softness left behind by labor. Inside the hall, she can feel that divide palpably. The chandeliers are meant to distribute light evenly, but light here shapes people into either gleam or shadow. Some faces are lit and expected to shine. Other faces, those that do not belong to the family, are part of the scenery. Lila has learned to negotiate that light, to step into it only when she chooses. A small, measured humiliation. At the rehearsal dinner, before the cushioned chairs and before the official vows, someone, a cousin, asks Lila in front of half the room, "Do you know how toasting works in our family?" The tone is a thinly veiled test. Vanessa's mouth curls with a smile that means fail. Lila answers politely, explains how she was taught at home by Ruth, who had once hosted block parties with paper cups and a large pot of stew. The room murmurs. A woman at the head table covers her mouth with a napkin as if laughter is contagious. It is a small wound, the type that can be described as learning to fit. The wound is not large enough to burst reputations, but large enough to make Lila memorize every step of being compact and unassuming. Gaslighting is quieter. "We just handle money better," Vanessa tells her once during a visit. "You wouldn't understand." It is a phrase that acts like a categorization, one that renders Lila's questions irresponsible, as if poverty is a cognitive deficit. Lila keeps exchanging her questions for notes in the ledger. The drift. Daniel begins to drift in a way that is simultaneously inexplicable and obvious. He is always ready with a compliment about the dress, and then absent for the matters that require a presence. He takes phone calls at the head table, his thumb moving across the screen as if those numbers are more urgent than the hand waiting on his lap. Lila watches him and feels a private grief, like watching a person slowly lose his shadow to light. There are moments, brief and luminous, when Daniel remembers the stoop and the dented mug. He will hold Ruth's hand and ask after a recipe. He will call in the middle of the night and say only one sentence that rings with meaning. "I miss you." Those moments are sanctuaries. They keep Lila loyal and hopeful. But loyalty does not exempt one from betrayal. The ledger is life. Months before the wedding, Lila had received a bank statement that did not match the promise. A line item showed a transfer to an account named in Daniel's family's companies, a transfer labeled vaguely enough that she had no right to assume it meant anything sinister. But patterns accumulate like snowfall. Each small shift of money becomes weight. She began to write everything down. At first it was for herself, to remember that something had been promised and never delivered. Then the ledger became an instrument of witness, a thing she could hold up to the light. She dated each entry like a person dating their living. Sept 5, $3,000 to Vanessa Enterprises. Her hand shook when she wrote sometimes. The ledger kept the trembling. A private conversation. A week before the wedding, Lila confronts Daniel in a hotel suite smelling of new leather. It is short and tender and terrible. He explains that consolidation is for efficiency, and that Vanessa knows more about managing the charitable fund than either of them did. "We wanted to make it simple," he says, almost pleading, as if simplicity could erase the unseen suffering it left. "I asked you to help Ruth," Lila replies, and in the air are all the nights Ruth had sat with a cup and a sigh. "I thought we were," he says. The words do not answer the ledger. He apologizes in a corporate way, a kind of apology that lines up with damage control rather than personal accountability. Lila accepts his apology because the heart does not always want to be righteous. Sometimes it wants the person it loves to be a little less broken. But she also hides the ledger under a mattress that night, where it makes the springs prickle like a secret. The decision. On the morning of the wedding, Lila has a quiet clarity that came not from rage alone, but from the long architecture of patience and the tenderness of small people who had kept them afloat. She thinks of Ruth's hands, calloused and gentle. She thinks of Maya's practical voice. She thinks of Pastor Samuel's short prayer. She decides to bring the ledger not because she wants to destroy, but because she wants the truth to have its day. The ledger is an object of proof, yes, but it is also a bouquet made of facts, evidence of a kindness redirected, of promises mislaid. She does not want spectacle. She wants a conscience stirred. She knows a ledger has no remedy on its own, but truth is the opening that makes repair possible. The walk down the aisle. People imagine a wedding walk as a mechanical progression. For Lila, it is an unpeeling. Each step echoes on the marble and pulls up memories embedded like stones in the road. Her shoes carry the weight of 100 small indignities and 1,000 quiet acts of service that have no public witness. She looks at faces and catalogs them, some kind, some blank, some malign with thin smiles. When she reaches Daniel, he takes her hands. The world condenses to his palms, a room where promises hover and sometimes frighten to float away. The priest asks for vows. The moment seems to stretch and hold like a glass blowing itself out thin. She breathes, and in that breath she remembers Ruth raising their bread like a benediction. The reach. Lila closes her fingers around the cloth bag. The bag is warm from her body. In it, the ledger presses like a small animal. She has rehearsed the move in her head dozens of times. She has not rehearsed the feeling of people's eyes on a small object. She slides her hands to her side and lifts the bag with the elegance of someone who has learned to carry heavy things quietly. She says, "Before I speak my vows, I need you to see something." A low rustle moves through the room. A bridesmaid taps her glass. Vanessa's face tightens. There is the minuet of a woman who knows her social realm might fracture if the choreography changes. Lila unbuttons the little coat she wore to hide the seam, the smallness, the poverty as if privacy were a garment. Her fingers go slow into the cloth, and when she pulls out the book, it looks smaller than anyone might have expected. It does not look like an accusation. It looks like a diary of transactions and promises that were never kept. The reveal. Immediate reaction. A soft gasp rises from the back. Someone exhales audibly. A child near the front tugs at his mother's sleeve and whispers, "Why is she holding that book?" The ritual machinery of the room pauses, a gear stuck. Vanessa takes 3 micro steps forward as if to intercept, then remembers the etiquette of pedigreed behavior and freezes. Eyes flick toward Daniel, full of question. He does not move. For a moment he seems unable to make sense of the object in his wife's hands. Then, like a person waking and realizing the ceiling is not where it used to be, he leans forward involuntarily. Lila opens the ledger with her thumb, exposing the neat dates and smudged ink. She touches a piece of tape holding a photograph in place. It is a picture of Ruth and Daniel, from a day where their hair was not yet taught how to behave. Ruth smiles like someone who is offering a meal and a prayer at once. Daniel holds the rim of her shoulder like a child might hold a safer place. Under the photo is a page of numbers, terse entries ending with words, roof, meds, rent. Each transfer has a transaction reference. Silence is a heavy thing in rooms like this. The priest fumbles with his script, as if the ceremonial text can keep reality from moving. Conversations become a net of low voices, small boats floating in the hush. People are not sure what to do when polite society stops behaving politely. Vanessa's mouth is a thin line. Her fingers clench, not toward the ledger but toward the pearl necklace at her throat, the pursed symbol of her armor. She begins to speak, the kind of words people use to redirect. This is not the time. But the room is already a different place. The ledger, with its battered cover and battered truth, has rearranged the furniture of attention. Lila reads aloud, not with a rage that scorches, but with a clarity that weighs facts. October 19th, transfer to Vanessa Enterprises, $5,000. Note, for Ruth's roof. She names each line, a ritual of noticing. Some people shift in their chairs. Others look at their programs as if the paper might shelter them. Daniel's face changes in a way Lila has never seen before. Not fury, not calm, but confusion that begins to fray into a pale recognition. He is being shown a ledger that includes his name, written by his wife's hand, a record of the misdirection of promises he thought had been kept. The guests wait for the sound the room will make. It is not one sound but an arrangement. Someone clearing a throat, a chair scraping, a child sobbing in confusion at the shifting mood. The priest is still looking for a place to land his words, but no sacred script could have prepared him for this. A woman whispers, "Is this for real?" And the voice unspools into a rumor that travels faster than any official statement could. People mutter. A pair of old friends exchange the kind of glance that has started many small revolutions, one eyebrow raising like a flag. And Daniel stands, caught between the public image of himself and a ledger that threatens to rewrite that image in ink. Transition point. For a heartbeat, the world is only ledger. Dates, numbers, Ruth's photo. For another heartbeat, Daniel's breath is a single held thing, like a man who cannot yet name what it is he is missing. Lila closes the notebook with hands that do not tremble. She feels Ruth's fingers in her memory. She feels Maya's steadying presence like a rope under her feet. She feels the congregation's small gasps, like a tide advancing. The room is not yet a courtroom, and yet the ledger has shifted the room into a space where accountability can arrive. The world leans forward, waiting for Daniel to decide which truth he will choose to inhabit. The truth of what wealth looks like when it is displayed, or the truth of what wealth does when it is diverted away from those it was meant to serve. Lila has done what she needed. She has taken control of the narrative by placing the ledger where everyone could see it. What happens next depends on choices not yet spoken. She stands, waiting for the sound that will reframe the rest of her life. She stands, waiting for the sound that will reframe the rest of her life. For a second, the room watches Daniel like a man who has been asked to choose a mirror. He takes a breath that catches at the edges of his composure. People lean in as if proximity might compel an answer. The light on his face is unkind and honest all at once. He steps back from the altar and, without altar theatrics, asks to speak to Lila outside the main hall. There is no accusation in his voice, only the roughness of a man surprised awake. Lila slides the ledger into the cloth bag with the movement of someone closing a small, important door. The hall hums like a hive that has been startled. Guests exchange glances that are less polite than curious. A small corridor behind the orchestra pit gives them a pocket of muted sound. Daniel's fingers find hers, and his palm is trembling when he says her name. Up close you can see the tracks of travel and attention on his face. Jet lag at his mouth, mercury-slick fatigue under his eyes. The grandeur that frames him at a distance is a different kind of costume up close, one that will not keep truth away. Lila, he says, and the name is both plea and question. Why now? She folds the ledger into stillness between them and answers with the patience she has used all these years. Because everyone else had chance after chance to notice, she says. Because the proofs are here. Because Ruth has a roof that leaks, and because I brought proof that the money meant for it was sent somewhere else. His face crumples in a way that is neither immediate guilt nor immediate defense. There is only a rapid, scrambling effort to rebuild a narrative that will make sense. He reaches for a phone and calls someone whose name is often a first resort for explanations. The chief financial officer at one of his companies. The line goes through with corporate precision. A voice, calm, practiced, answers. Daniel asks, then says a name and an account number. The words are small and quick, and all the while he is watching Lila as if trying to read her expression like a balance sheet. Back in the hall, Vanessa hears a phrase. Ledgers, transfers, Vanessa Enterprises. And she feels a prickle sliding under the polite veneer. She moves toward the back with the careful pace of someone repping control. In public, she is a study of composed outrage. She enters the corridor before the company lawyer matters can be threaded into the conversation. She reaches Daniel first, places a cool hand on his sleeve. This is a theatrics moment, she whispers, the voice that trims things into harmless shapes. We can step aside, discuss later. Daniel's eyes find hers in a way Lila has not seen before, searching, hungry for certainty. Vanessa's smile does not reach those eyes. It bends like a shield. She tries to charm the moment away, to tuck it into the pocket of familial embarrassment. But something in the ledger's sparse authority has already begun slow work. It gathers evidence into gravity. They do not argue in the corridor. There is no raised voice. Instead, there is the lower, more dangerous tone of people who know how to negotiate power. Vanessa offers a story of administrative error, of accounts mislabeled for tax efficiency, of invoices to shell companies used for philanthropic disbursements. The tone is corporate and plausible and practiced. Daniel listens. He hears what his CFO confirms. There are transfers, and yes, a named corporate entity under Vanessa's control has received funds earmarked Family Trust, funds that were promised to Ruth. He asks for time. He asks for privacy. He asks the CFO to put an audit on immediate action and to bring the books to the table. He asks Vanessa to account for the transfers. Vanessa, who had counted on procedural friction to blur the edges of misdirection, feels the floor shift. In private, she tries another move, blame the assistant who handles accounts, then the temporary consultant. Each pivot is a smaller and smaller platform on which truth can stand. Outside the halls, the congregation of witnesses disperses into pockets that talk and text and wonder. Phones blossom with photographs. The ledger, Ruth's photograph taped to the page, the neat script of dates. The internet, that hungry second room, will not let a small thing stay small for long. But for now, the moment remains in the hall. People caught between their training and politeness, and a new, heavier question that racks through them. Whom have we been celebrating? The immediate fallout. Daniel does what men with assets do when they realize their life is built on assumptions. He starts with verification. He sits with the CFO in a quiet office above the ballroom. They pull transaction logs, email threads, authorization forms. The first thing that becomes clear is not malice but convenience. Multiple small transfers labeled vaguely enough to be routed without parentheses of scrutiny. The second thing that becomes clear is the pathway. Vanessa Enterprises is more than a name. It is a corporate entity registered under Vanessa's oversight, with access to accounts the family had trusted her to manage. When Daniel understands, he does something raw and difficult. He who had learned to build bridges between opportunity and consequence decides he wants to build a different kind of bridge, one that spans the gulf between wealth and accountability. He walks back into the hall with a color in his face Lila has never seen. He does not perform the old public smile. Instead, he goes to the microphone with a directness that halts ceremony. He tells the room, plainly, that there will be a delay, that personal matters require attention. He asks for privacy, then for mercy. Nothing performative. Only the immediate thing he cannot not do. Call an audit and demand answers. Vanessa stands frozen for the taste of a long second, then composes the expected sorrow and murmured dismay that the social script requires. She does not, at that moment, loudly deny. She seeks to round the edges of accusation. But the public has something now it did not have before, an object that points clear and stubborn to a reality no rumor can easily erase. The family divides into camps that look like safety zones, those who will not jeopardize social arrangement, those who are startled into quiet shame, those who hunch toward the ever-present safety of silence. There are whispers about proprieties and about decorum. But some faces, older kin who remember simpler associations, look hollowed. They had known promises made between a young man and his mother. They had watched him leave a stoop and return with a briefcase. The ledger's photograph flicks like a small private candle in a room that had long forgotten the original flame. Vanessa's first spin. In the days that follow, Vanessa moves like a woman arranging her wardrobe before a storm. She drafts statements and rehearses phrases that will soften exposure into mislabeling. She distributes talking points to allies. She presents herself to PR consultants in a way that recalls the bracing of armor. But practice and optics cannot repair the ledger's slow, accumulative testimony. Dates, amounts, repeated transfers that align with months Ruth had written about leaks and bills. There are legalities, lawyers who speak in measured tones about fiduciary responsibility and asset access. There is, importantly, no immediate criminal certainty. The law moves with processes and definitions that a public scandal can prompt, but not necessarily dictate. Daniel's team, unaccustomed to being surprised, convene a council and, on counsel's advice, freeze further authorization to the family trust account until an internal reconciliation can be run. Vanessa is asked to step down temporarily from finance roles while the audit proceeds. That act, small and administrative, feels to Vanessa like a first severing. She calls it disproportionate. She says the family overreacts. The newspapers breathe in and out. Social feeds map the sound of outrage and confusion into commentary. For Lila, this is not thrilling. It is instead a thin relief, something akin to wind moving the heat off a summer day. She has not sought fame. She has sought notice, not noise. The ledger has opened a window. Now something in it must be closed with repair. Ruth's rescue. While accounts are examined, the real immediate task is the tangible. Ruth's roof and the small architecture of a life. Daniel goes to the little house where Ruth has been sleeping on chairs because a leak softened part of the floor. He steps out of the car and there is no grandness in his motion, only the awkwardness of a man who has worn his wealth like a coat that never touched his mother's floor. Ruth sits on a stoop with a blanket over her knees, and when she looks up at him, there is a memory in her face. A smile that is part astonishment and part the ordinary confidence one has in things one has built by hand. He kneels, saying sorry in the language of those who finally choose to do work rather than words. He apologizes not for the ledger alone, but for the absence that made all this plausible. I should have, he begins, then stops because the sentence cannot easily hold the weight of years. Ruth takes his hand as if she holds a small bird, and the gesture makes him smaller, then larger. She says little because she does not need to be the repository for his penance. She says simply, "We'll fix it." They bring a contractor. They replace tiles. They patch the roof. They replace the rusted cutlery and buy a new kettle. The congregation brings a mattress and blankets. Pastor Samuel stands with a toolbox in the back of the truck and hands a screwdriver like a blessing. Mr. Peter arrives with a stack of food sacks and sits down for tea. The work is less about the money than about the body politics of dignity. People who know how to fix the small ruins of life show up to stitch them. The first good meal Ruth eats, soup that does not taste of long days of water, makes her eyes shine in a way that sunlight cannot fake. Lila watches and thinks success looks different when it is measured by the fullness of a bowl. The private confrontation. When the audit shows a clean path, what had looked like convoluted accounting begins to reveal a route. Daniel arranges a deliberate private conversation with Vanessa. The lawyer sits in the next room with neutral faces like a firewall. The conversation itself is less about paper and more about the social currency Vanessa had spent, the translucence of favor and the opacity of self-interest. He asks her what she did with the transfers, why she chose, if she had chosen, to divert resources meant for Ruth. Vanessa answers with the practiced vocabulary of self-defense. She insists funds were used for broader family philanthropy, for investment in community projects that had contractual invoices. She suggests mislabeling by an overworked assistant. The law is a slow tool, morality a quicker, more immediate blade. She looks at him for understanding, and sees exhaustion where she had hoped for steel. The exchange betrays cracks. There are emails he had not read, signed forms she had authorized without his signature, and conversations with third parties who confirm that Vanessa had wide authority in family accounts. The ledger, small and frayed in Lila's hands, is one thread of a tapestry that now begins to show where fabric was replaced. The evidence is not cinematic proof of a crime. It is the slow, bureaucratic proof of neglect and misdirection, of someone who used trust as a personal resource. Vanessa chooses points. She claims she believed she was protecting the family's reputation. She claims her actions were pragmatic. The room hummed with the kind of cold argument that builds a wall. Daniel considers options: removal of authority, restitution of diverted funds, possible civil suits if restitution is refused. He does not want spectacle. He wants repair. He also knows that his silence will be a form of assent. In the end, Vanessa is asked and then ordered by counsel under family corporate governance to return funds that can be traced. She resists. Emotions swell into a more public display. A statement from the family. A press interview in which Vanessa paints herself as a scapegoat. The public divides, but the people in the room, the older relatives who recall small things, see that what had been stored in silence has been opened. Lila's choice. Through all this, Lila has agency. The ledger brought truth into light. It did not dictate consequences. She watches the legal maneuvers and chicken skin apologies. She sits with Ruth. She prays with Pastor Samuel in a corner that is not a stage. And she listens to Maya, who reminds her that dignity is not a sword. When Daniel, after meetings and a night that left him gray-white with thought, says he wants to make restitution, Lila asks what form that restitution should take. She could, after months of humiliation, ask for a divorce that would remove her from the orbit of in-law manipulation forever. She does not. Her love for Daniel is not blind. It is measured. She wants change. She wants accountability. She wants the energy of wealth to be used to repair the small human erasures it allowed. They talk long in the living room where Lila has kept the ledger. He says he will redirect funds. He says he will not simply write checks. Instead, he wants to set up a transparent fund with outside auditors to repair what was damaged and to create a small endowment for people like Ruth. He will repurpose a property the family owned, a lakeside home that had sat used mostly for display, into a community shelter and resource center. He will place Vanessa on unpaid leave pending a formal restitution plan. He will step back from certain boards to learn how presence matters more than appearances. He will, crucially, begin attending the Sunday service next to Lila and Ruth rather than reading his phone at the head of tables. Lila hears his words and watches his efforts, not as tokens but as labor. She sees him wake early to call contractors, to visit the shelter plans, to sit with Pastor Samuel in meetings about governance. She sees him choose to change. She also sees him stumble. Old habits die slowly. But slow healing is still healing. Restitution, practical and public. The legal steps are not quick, nor are they entirely theatrical. There are meetings in lawyers' offices where Vanessa is represented by her counsel. There are mediated conversations about returning funds and about compensation for harm. Where money can be tracked, restitution is negotiated. Bank transfers rerouted, small but meaningful sums forwarded to cover Ruth's missed expenses, and a formal family agreement that places the family trust under a board that includes independent family members and community representatives. Daniel sits in those rooms and signs what needs to be signed. He funds immediate repairs to Ruth's house, pays for medical checks she had deferred, and deposits an amount into a fund for the neighborhood initiatives Ruth had always imagined. He speaks publicly of mistakes, of negligence, of how absence compounded harm. He does not hurl Vanessa into ruin. Instead, he secures repair and accountability. Vanessa, stripped of direct access, reacts with anger, and then, as the legal scaffolding tightens, with a performative contrition that some believe and others do not. Public opinion will not be neat. The press will write the narrative into lines. But the practical work, the replaced roof, the repainted walls, Ruth's new kettle, does not wait for headlines. It grows like careful stitches. Community and church as anchor. Throughout, the church remains a shelter in the less sensational ways that matter. People bring meals when Ruth has a doctor's appointment. Mr. Peter organizes morning shifts to check on her when the contractors come, making sure she is not isolated while men with ladders work on her roof. Pastor Samuel organizes a small committee to help oversee the fund that Daniel has started, insisting on transparency and humility. There are moments when the church's help is gentle and quiet. A neighbor who mends a curtain, a woman who brings a basket of laundry to Ruth and hangs it on her line. Lila and Daniel attend a Sunday service not as spectacle but as practice. Worship becomes a habit of small humilities and public confession, a place where promises are renewed in people's presence. The shelter. The former lakeside house becomes a project that tangibly reframes family fortune. It is neither a PR stunt nor a salvation. Daniel funds renovations. Neighborhood craftspeople and church volunteers provide labor and guidance. They open a small shelter that provides temporary housing for elderly neighbors, for mothers with children in need, for someone who needs a shower and a safe place for a night. The family mansion's staff are rehired in roles that help manage the center. Vanessa, no longer at the helm, watches the transformation with a public face that hides private dismay. The shelter is modest at first. Beds, a few rooms, a kitchen that smells of soup and fresh bread. But it becomes a place where Ruth's neighbors come for classes in budgeting, where Mr. Peter leads weekly meals, and where Pastor Samuel runs counseling hours. The symbolism of repurposing a display of wealth into a shelter is not lost on the city, but the shelter's quiet growth is the point. People who had once been invisible now have a place with a red roof and a bowl on a porch. Maya helps run a small training center there for women who want to learn trades, sewing, bookkeeping, crafts. Lila teaches a class on keeping ledgers, on the dignity of record keeping, and in doing so she changes her ledger from weapon to lesson. How to notice promises, how to keep them, how to make them public without rancor. Vanessa's fall and a strange mercy. Vanessa loses social standing the way a sculpture loses polish, gradually and then suddenly. Invitations dry up, people who once smiled pull away. Some of the family rebukes her, not with scream but with the steady domestic removal of small courtesies. She seeks to explain through interviews and well-spun narratives. She attempts to paint herself as a woman protecting family interests from waste. In private conversations held in less forgiving rooms, she is confronted with cancelled authorizations and signatures she must now explain. There is also a strange mercy. The family, pressed by Daniel's insistence on repair over spectacle, does not attempt to eject her from family life altogether. Instead, they refuse to let her use the family machinery for personal benefit. She must reckon with consequence, not with exile. Rebuilding reputation here is less about social re-entry and more about accepting limits. The groom's reckoning. Daniel does not become a saint overnight. He grieves his own neglect with a seriousness that sometimes looks like self-punishment. He takes long walks with Ruth and listens to the stories she tells about the stoop and the dented mug. He wakes early now, and sometimes he arrives at the shelter before dawn, sleeves rolled, listening to the small emergencies that need attending. He is clumsy at first in the practice of humility, forgetting to schedule a meeting, calling with an apology that sounds corporate in domestic surroundings. But he learns. He goes to the board meetings and insists on independent oversight. He signs checks that go to local programs, he writes letters to neighbors, he sits in the front pew the Sunday he and Lila decide to slow their travels. The change is not only public but domestic. The couple begins to build a different daily rhythm. Rebuilding a home. The decision they make, private and modest, is to live for a time not in the penthouse but in a small house that sits near the shelter. It is modest in city terms, 3 rooms, a porch with room for a small garden, and a red roof that matches the shelter across town. They choose it not out of penance but out of preference. The house hums with the sound of birds and the smell of earth, a daily set of small domestic rituals that resists grand isolation. They do not flee wealth. They simply refuse to let it hoard their lives. Daniel sets aside a schedule, mornings for family, afternoons for work in small windows, evenings for neighborhood walks. Lila plants herbs in clay pots, a daily practice that is both literal and symbolic. Hands in soil, not checkbox philanthropy. Ruth moves into the house next door with a patch of yard where she grows basil and a cracked bowl that holds water for the neighbor's cat. The cracked bowl is fixed by Mr. Peter as a gift. The crack remains, honored, an emblem of repair, not erasure. Daily rituals, slow healing meals become a means of calibration. Breakfasts are simple, stewed fruit, toast, coffee. They sit at a table that is often cluttered with small things. A ledger that no longer needs to be opened in public. A handkerchief Ruth had embroidered. A bowl Maya made in a ceramics class at the shelter. They talk about money in sentences that include specifics, budgets, auditable steps, people who manage funds, and they talk about family and sentences that contain time, afternoons to be present, Sunday services to attend, a care schedule for Ruth. There are awkward conversations. Daniel confesses the nights he prioritized deals over dinners. Lila confesses the nights she swallowed pride for peace. They apologize in ways that are deliberate and unshowy. They negotiate safety and trust. The work is both practical and spiritual, redistributing tasks, having financial transparency, and building time together. Community justice, not revenge. The resolution chooses restitution over revenge. Vanessa faces the consequences of loss of power, public trust, and legal restraint where appropriate. But the story does not end in spectacular ruin. Lila does not gloat. She does not use the ledger to erect a monument to humiliation. Instead, she uses it as a map to repair. She works with Pastor Samuel to set up a community advisory board for the shelter. She teaches ledger keeping to women who had never thought of themselves as managers of money. The ledger becomes pedagogy. There is a public ceremony months later when the shelter opens formally. It is smaller than the wedding had been and more human. Daniel, Lila, Ruth, Pastor Samuel, Mr. Peter, Maya, and neighbors stand together and cut a ribbon. The cameras catch it, of course, but the real images are quieter. A woman who had been homeless for a spell holds a plate of stew and laughs. An old neighbor takes Ruth's hand. Vanessa is absent. The absence is not joy. It is simply the natural consequence of choices made. A small tree. On a damp morning, Lila plants a small tree in the shelter's yard. Ruth holds the shovel. Daniel kneels in the mud and places the first clump of earth. The tree is sapling thin, not yet tall enough to shade anyone, but in its fragility there is a promise. They plant it not as penance but as planter of daily witness. Growth takes time and attention. Lila presses a small stone next to the sapling. On it she carves, modestly, without ceremony, the ledger's initials. It is not for victory, it is for memory, to remind those who live there that truth is a thing that must be tended like a plant. The crack bowl sits beneath the eaves and catches rain, the new rhythm. Months fold like pages. The shelter remains modest and busy. The lakeside house's ceremony is an origin story told with humility. Daniel's companies establish a small matching program to fund local projects. He visits the shelter during off hours. He learns the names of volunteers and how to peel an apple without slicing a finger. Lila's classes thrive. Women who took the ledger lessons now teach others how to keep records and demand accountability. Maya starts a micro-business with women who sew and sell goods at weekend markets, profits going back to the shelter. Ruth goes to the shelter's community dinners and tells stories about the stoop and the dented mug. Her hands, once much given, are now much received. The marriage is not immaculate. It is repaired in the honest domestic way of small refusals of old harms. Daniel sometimes falters, the weight of his former life tugging at him like gravity. Lila sometimes wonders whether honesty will always be like a ledger she must reopen. But the daily rhythms, breakfast together, church services, small acts of neighbor care, become the true ledger of their life, entries not of money, but of time and attention. An unlikely reconciliation. Vanessa's separation from the family's finances forces her into smaller rooms, where she must confront motives without adoring mirrors. Her steps toward restitution are uneven. At one point she offers a public statement of regret and a pledge to volunteer at the shelter. Some accept, some do not. Time, not spectacle, judges. One afternoon she shows up at the shelter with a box of aprons, the gesture awkward and human. Maya, who runs the kitchen projects, hesitates and then accepts the aprons. There is no public rejoicing, no restored status. There is, instead, a slow reopening of possibility, the kind that only regular presence can build. The ledger's rest. In time, the ledger, that weathered small book, no longer needs to be displayed as evidence. Lila keeps it in a drawer at home. Its pages remain a map of harm and of promises. She flips through it sometimes, not to reopen wounds, but to remember the work required to keep truth from going missing. The book is a relic of action, not revenge. At the shelter's anniversary, Lila gives a short talk about small things. The dignity paid in daily acts, the way a bowl of soup can be a covenant, the way a ledger can be a teacher. She asks the crowd not for applause, but for a willingness to notice. People clap, not for her, but for what they know themselves to be called to do. Final image. Years after the wedding, years, not months, the couple sits on a small porch that looks over a garden where herbs and vegetables spill into one another. Ruth tends a basil plant with the care of an artist. Children from the shelter play with an old dog that sleeps at the foot of a cracked bowl. Daniel reads local newsletters aloud, in a voice that sometimes stumbles into laughter. Lila stitches a small handkerchief while watching neighbors pass, each name now familiar. The ledger rests in a drawer with a hand-stitched handkerchief Ruth once made. It is not boxed as a trophy, nor burned as forgetfulness. It is preserved as a record of what vigilance and love can do together. The red roof of the shelter glows at dusk, like an answering beacon. When neighbors ask what changed him, Daniel shrugs as if to make light of the shape of his own journey. "There was a ledger," he says, "and some small women who taught me to look." His voice is gentle and repentant, but it is steady. Lila listens, and in her face there is the quiet of someone who kept her dignity in a room built to measure worth in other ways. She had entered that hall with a small cloth bag and a sewn book. She had stepped out with more than a victory. She had stepped out with a life remade, not by ruin but by reconstruction. The humiliation that could have hollowed her became a pivot that shifted priorities. Wealth used as a tool for shelter, presence over display, and the slow, patient work of daily care. In the evening, they walk together to the shelter and sit on a bench. Ruth brings bread and jam. Pastor Samuel hums softly a hymn that is not performance but practice. For a long time, they sit in that simple silence, seeing not the ledger as an end, but as the beginning of a different order. One where people are not viewed as numbers, and where promises are recorded and kept. Share how you would have acted if you were in Lila's place, and if you've seen community kindness change someone's life. Tell us below.